So welcome everyone. We are going to talk about forms in Angular. So is anyone familiar with how we do forms in Angular? Has anyone ever done anything with forms? So I have. Oh yeah, most people. That's pretty good. So my name is Alain. I'm a GDE in web technologies, more specifically Angular, also a little bit of Google Maps. And I come from Sacramento, California. And I've been working with AngularJS for a long time, started back in 2011. So that's almost 9 years ago now. And what I do for a living is I do web consulting and technical training, and my company is called angulartraining.com. So that's what I do. Now, let's talk about all of these different form features that we have in Angular. So I'm going to start with the different properties that Angular has and automatically adds to all of the elements that we have in a form. So there are 6 of them, and you're probably familiar with them, so it's a reminder of what these 6 properties are. The first one is pristine. So this means that nothing has changed in your form, it just got loaded, and the user hasn't done anything with the form yet. Then when the user does something, so enters some data or selects an element in a dropdown, the form becomes dirty. So all of these properties, they go in pairs. Pristine is the opposite of dirty. Then we have valid, invalid. So if everything is valid in the form is valid. If not, it's invalid. And then we have touched and untouched. So touched and untouched are a little bit trickier, because touched happens when you click on an element, so the element gets some focus, and then loses that focus. So you click away from it, basically, then it becomes touched. But that's only when the focus is lost that the element becomes touched. Otherwise, it is still untouched. So let's take a look at how Angular gives us access to these different properties. And the first way Angular does this is by adding some CSS classes. So if I take a look at the form here, we have a bunch of elements. And if I take a look at my entire form, or just this first drop-down here, this first input, we see that there are a bunch of classes added to it. So here they are. So right now, my form is untouched, pristine, and invalid. And that's because it just got loaded. We didn't do anything with it. So that's what it is. And now if I click here and type just one letter, then you can see that it changed. And now my form is dirty and invalid and touched. So Angular does that automatically for us. We just provide some validation rules, and then it's going to apply those CSS classes. And what I did here, as you can see, this input has a slightly different border here. It's green, and it's a few pixels wide. And this one down here is red. And the way I've done this is basically by just providing the CSS classes. And then Angular is going to set them for me or remove them depending on the state of my form. So let's take a look at the code behind this. So that's a CSS for that component. And in my CSS, I provided 2 different classes. So one is ng-valid, one is ng-invalid. And you can see that for ng-valid, I just add this border to the left side. And just to prove you that this actually works, I can go one step further and say that we're going to have a light green background color on the input, because that selector only applies to the text input. And that would turn the background color of that input to green. And that's all I have to do, really. This input in my template is required. And because it is required, we have to enter a value. If we don't enter a value, it's invalid. As soon as I enter a value, it's going to become valid. And we'll see that green background color. So let's refresh. Now it's red. And as I type something, now we have the green background color. So all I did really was 2 things, CSS and this required keyword here. So nice and easy. So that's one way to access that information. Those 6 different properties, we have them through CSS classes. But we have other options. And one of these other options is to actually access those properties from the ng-Form directive. So here, I'm doing hashtag form equals ng-Form, and this gives me a reference to the form directive applied to that specific form. And once I have that reference, I can use it to get access to all of this. So is the form valid, is it dirty, pristine, touched, untouched, and all of that. So that's for the entire form, and we have the same info for every single element in that form. So if I want to access that for a specific input, I can use the same hashtag syntax, hashtag street equals ng-model, and that gives me the same info. That street variable now has valid, invalid, touched, untouched, and pristine and dirty. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what we can do with that. So one thing that this form does is that it has a zip code here, and this zip code has to be 5 digits, 5 numbers. So if I start entering something, you can see that there's a red error message that shows up and says, hey, you have to enter a 5-digit zip code. The way I did this is very simple, because that's the code down here that makes this happen. So this input for the zip code, we have the hashtag zip equals ng-model. So that's how I get access to the directive and these properties. And then up here, with a simple ng-if, I'm going to say that if my text input is invalid and dirty, so if the user entered something, but the input is not valid itself, then we're going to display, please enter a 5-digit zip code. So I'm combining 2 of the 6 properties together so that the message shows up only when the user enters something. And the validation rule that makes this happen is this. So here I'm just using an HTML property called pattern, where we can use a regular expression, which basically says this has to be a 5-digit number. And you can use any kind of regular expression here to make this happen. So very nice and easy. It's really just HTML for this, and a bunch of Angular directives to show my error message. And so if I get back to the form, we have 3 digits in here, and if I go to 5, then the error goes away, and oops, and my screen goes away too. Because all is good. Come on, come back. Yeah, it's going to come back in a second. There we go. So yeah, 5 digits, everything is valid, so we get the green background, everything is fine. And of course, if I keep changing it and just remove one of these digits, it comes back. So all of that, we get it automated just by using these different properties from Angular itself. So that's really nice. So now we saw how to do some basic validation. We're just using HTML feature and Angular directives to make this happen. But what if we want to do something more custom? If we want to have our own custom validation rules and make sure that our form is fully valid? So Angular gives us support for that as well. And the main way to do it is to provide a validator function. That function is very basic. All it does is it takes a control as an input. So one of the parameters for that function is an abstract control, which is any form element, basically is an abstract control in Angular. And then from there, we're going to return a list of errors or null if everything is valid. So you just validate the value of the control. If everything is good, you just return null. If you have some errors, you return them. And these validation errors is just keys and values. So you can build that any way you want and create as many errors as you want with the key and the value that makes sense for that specific validation that you're doing. So once we create that function, and I'm going to do that in a few seconds, so we are going to use it to validate a credit card number. So that function, I'm going to call it validate CC number. And I'm going to do my validation in that function, make sure that the credit card number is valid. And in order for this to be applied to my form, so this is a reactive form. That's the example for a reactive form. We're going to see how to do it with a template-driven form a little bit later. We just pass a reference to that function as a parameter when we build the form. And that's all we have to do. Once you do this, create a function that does the validation and plug it in to the reactive form, then you're all set. And Angular is going to use that, run that function every time the value changes, and update the state of ng-valid or ng-invalid for you. So let's take a look at this. So I'm going to go back to my code and go to the reactive form component. So that's the validate credit card number function. So it takes a control as a parameter, returns some validation errors, if any. And what I do here in terms of validation is very basic. Don't do that in production, just an example. It's really a fairly basic check that I do here. So I'm checking that the credit card number starts with 3 different prefixes, and that's American Express, Visa, or MasterCard, I think, something like this. But it's not perfect, so don't do that in production. And if that's good, then we don't return any error. But if that is not the case, then I return my own custom error. So the key for this is credit card, so I know that it comes from my credit card input. And then I provide an error message, which is, it is not a credit card from a supported provider. So that's validation number 1 that I do here. And the next thing I'm going to check is that if we pass that first check, then I'm going to make sure that we have 16 digits. If that's the case, we are good. If not, I return a second type of error from that function. And if we pass all of that, we just return null. So that's a validator function, nice and easy. Once it is created, I just pass that reference to my register, to my form builder here. So I build the form with all of the different fields in it and use that custom validator function in here. And that's it. Now this should work. So let's give it a try. I'm going to move to the right demo. So we get to the reactive form, and if I start my credit card number with, let's say, 7, then we get the error message that says the credit card number is not from a supported provider because it doesn't start with 4, 5, or 37. And if I start with 4, then it tells me that I need 16 digits. So this is using my custom validator function and displaying an error if things go wrong. So every time I change, we go through that code. And if we have errors, then they're going to be rendered thanks to the following. So what I added in my template is a simple ng-if that says if we have any errors on the input with the name CC for credit card, then I just get that error that has the key credit card. And that's how I get my custom message and display it. So that way, if later on we have to add some new kinds of errors, we just change the validator function, and that's it. Then this is automatically going to use the right error message and display it. So we have a custom validator for a reactive form. Now, how do we do it for a template-driven form? It's actually very similar. We still need a validator function that we're going to use. But it's a little bit more tricky in the way that we actually need to create a directive for this. So it's basically a simple recipe that you have to follow. You create your directive, and then in terms of dependency injection, you have to do the following here, where you tell Angular that this directive is a validator directive. So this line of code here, provide ng-validators, use existing credit card validator. That's a way to tell Angular, OK, we just created a new validator directive. You can use it as a directive now. That's a part of your ng-validators. And then that directive has to do one more thing, which is to implement a validator interface. And that validator interface itself is just like the function that we saw earlier. Same kind of signature, takes a control as a parameter and returns errors or null. So what I'm going to do in my example of directive is that instead of doing the validation in here, in that method, I'm going to actually use a static method. So what I do here is credit card validator validates CC number, and here I do my validation inside that static method. And the reason why I do this is because it's a trick that we're going to use so that this code can be used with both a template-driven form and a reactive form. So you don't have to write it twice or just duplicate that function. You create that directive once for all, and then you can use it as a directive on a template-driven form, or use the syntax that we saw earlier for a reactive one. So if I want to use it on my template-driven form, it's a directive. So we just add that attribute to the element that we want to validate. Easy enough. And that would make it happen. So let's give it a try. I'm going to go back to my template-driven form and take a look at the code here. So now, instead of using that function, I'm going to remove it and use the one from my own directive. And that's why I made it static earlier. So I can just pass a reference to it from the directive, and that takes care of my reactive form. So now my reactive form is able to deal with this. And so that would work in the case of a reactive form. And for the template-driven one, we do this by adding the directive just like this. So the selector for my directive is app credit card validator. And because of that, that's what I'm going to use in here to have that validation be applied to that input. So let's see if it works. Getting back here. I'm on my template-driven form, getting refreshed. And if I type a credit card number, then we have a message that shows up, and that tells me that I did something wrong. And this message is the following one. So I just did ng-if invalid, then please enter a valid credit card number. So that's a directive applied to a template-driven form, and it works perfectly. So just to show you that in the end, that's all we need really for the validation. So that's a directive with all of the code in it. So you would generate that directive with Angular CLI. You would then make it implement validator. And validator is an interface that comes from Angular forms. So that's what I do up here. Once this is done, I implement the validate method. And the validate method then calls my static method that does the actual validation. And then it's just the same validation rules in here, and we're all good to go. So nice and easy, isn't it? And of course, if you have multiple different validation rules or multiple different forms that you want to validate with this, you could just create multiple different directives. As long as you follow that same recipe and apply it to all of your directives, then you can use them with a template-driven form or a reactive form. It doesn't matter. So you don't have to make that decision up front. You just follow that recipe and you're good to go. So with that in mind, so this works with both kinds of forms. I already did this in my code and added the validate credit card number reference in here. And I can just show you that this actually works. So back to my reactive form. And if I type something wrong, then we get the error message as expected. And that's the other error message. So everything is still working fine with that new directive. So these are all of the links for everything I just showed you. I actually wrote a blog post last year about all of this, so I put the link in here. So if you want to see step by step how this was built, you can get the blog post and read it. The code for that example is on Stack Blitz as well, so you can go there and just use something similar. My slides, everything is included in here. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope this was useful to you. Thanks again.